The fog pushed down heavily on the streets of London that night, curling like pale ghosts around the gas lamps. It pulled a chill from the stones of Baker Street that seemed to go right into your bones. I remember the time well, for the fire in our living room had burned low. Holmes, with his long legs stretched across the sofa, sat in a silence so deep that even the ticking of the clock on the shelf seemed like a loud noise. It was in that quiet moment that a knock, fast and shaky, broke the stillness. I did not know then that the man who stumbled into our rooms, with his coat torn and eyes wide with fear, carried with him the shadow of a crime so strange, so full of forgotten rules, that it would test Holmes's mind to its very limit, and pull us into the hidden corners of London's oldest neighborhoods. The story that follows is not just about blood and broken promises, but about secrets kept in basements under the city, where old science and greed worked together in the dark, and where death had picked its spot. If you find yourself, as I once did, pulled in by the mystery, eager to step with us into fog and danger, I would ask you to stay with this story. Let the shadows of London open before you. And if the story grabs your imagination, do not wait to share it, so that others too may walk with Holmes and me into the maze of crime. Subscribe to this journey, just as you would open a door into Baker Street itself, and allow the story to unfold while you are with us. The night was one of those damp, creeping evenings when the air itself seems alive. A restless blanket of mist curled through the narrow streets of London, swallowing up sound and color until only the flicker of gaslight remained, a shaking ring of light against the dark. The hour was late. Mrs. Hudson had gone to bed long ago, and the street below lay empty, except for the occasional rattle of a distant carriage, or the sad cry of a watchman making his rounds. Inside our living room at Baker Street, the fire had burned down to its last glowing coals, and Sherlock Holmes lay sprawled on the sofa, one long arm hanging to the floor, the other resting on a violin bow. The faintest music had just died on the strings, a ghost of a tune, sad and unfinished, which had seemed to me less like a performance than a deep thought about something too serious for words. I remember leaning back in my chair, half asleep because of the late hour, when there came a sudden knock. 3 fast taps on the door, urgent and unsteady, like the hand of a man being chased. Holmes's eyes snapped open. He did not move at once, but sat up slowly, as if listening not just to the knock itself, but to the silence that followed it. "You notice, Watson," he whispered softly, "the rhythm of fear. Few men knock like that unless they are either desperate or about to do something foolish." I stood up to let our visitor in, and I had barely unlocked the door when a man stumbled inside. His coat was torn. His hat was soaked through with fog, and his face was as pale as death. "Dr. Watson," I cried out, for at first glance I thought the man had been hurt. That was how twisted his face looked, and how much his body shook. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "you must come. You must come right away. It is murder, sir. A most unnatural murder." His voice cracked, and he sank into the nearest chair, breathing as though he had run halfway across the city. Holmes looked at him sharply, but said nothing for a moment. Then, with that strange kindness he sometimes showed to the most upset clients, he poured a glass of brandy and set it before the man. "You have been running, sir," Holmes noted, "and from the look of your sleeve, I would guess you brushed against a wall. It was newly painted white somewhere south of the river, perhaps near Lambeth. The clay on your boots proves it. Now, calm yourself and begin at the beginning. Who has been murdered?" The man took a shaking sip, his eyes darting between us as though he wasn't sure of the very ground he stood on. "My name is Phelps, Jonathan Phelps. I am a clerk working for Mr. Ambrose Leighton, the chemist and alchemist, some would say, though that word brings a bad reputation. He stays in a house near the river, and underneath it is a cellar set up for his experiments. Glass tubes, furnaces, strange machines that I barely understand. It was there I found him. Found him this very evening, sir. Dead. He pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. And God forgive me. It was as though he had been burned without fire. His face was black, and the air was thick with a smell of metal and ash. Holmes leaned forward, the light of the lamp casting a sharp shine across his eyes. At what time did you find the body? A little after 10. I had gone to deliver some bills and found the door slightly open. The fire in the furnace was out, yet the air was hot and hard to breathe. There was glass on the floor, a broken flask, I think, and something humming, faint but terrible, like the dying sound of a musical tuning fork. I could not stay. I ran for help, but when I brought the police officer from the bridge, the room was cold, and he hesitated, and the door was locked. Holmes put his fingertips together. Locked from the inside, so it appeared, yet I swear it was open when I ran away. There followed a silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. As Holmes stood up and took his violin from the shelf. He pulled the bow once across the strings, making a single low note that hung in the air before fading into quiet. A locked cellar, he said thoughtfully. A man burned without flame, a smell of metal, and a door that changes its mind. Interesting. Tell me, Mr. Phelps, was there any sign of robbery? None, sir. Nothing was taken. The shelves were just as they had been. Jars, powders, record books, all in their places. Holmes nodded. Then we are dealing not with greed, but with knowledge. A murder committed to keep someone quiet, not for money. Watson, get your hat. We are going at once. Within minutes, we were out in the street, the fog sticking to our coats and curling through the yellow glow of the lamps, like smoke through the roof beams of a ruined hall. Phelps stumbled between us, mumbling to himself about the cellar and of things best left unspoken. Holmes walked quickly, his face set, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes in shadow. There is more to this. Watson, he said at last. I can almost hear the pattern faintly, just as one hears the sea in a shell. But the answer lies in the change. That strange change of the body, burned without fire. You said? There are only so many things in this world capable of doing that, and most of them belong to the world of science or superstition. We turned into a lane so narrow that the fog hung still above it. Like a still white sea. A smell of the river drifted up from somewhere unseen, mixed with the smell of tar and smoke. Phelps led us to a small, run-down building squeezed between two warehouses, its window shuttered, its door showing the faint mark of a hand smeared with ash. He lived here, Phelps whispered. Below is the cellar. Holmes knelt, running his fingers along the lock. New scratches, he whispered. Someone tried to force this open, and recently. Yet the police, you say, found it closed. He glanced at me. There is trouble here, Watson. Get your revolver. We may not be the first people to come back to this room tonight. The door opened at his touch, and a gust of stale metallic air hit us as though the cellar itself breathed out. The way down was steep, stone steps slippery with wetness, leading into a room with a low ceiling and lined with shelves. The faint light of dying coals glowed inside a small furnace at the far end, and on the floor, stretched out on a pile of soot and broken glass, lay what remained of Ambrose Leighton. The body was twisted, the face shriveled as if pulled inward by an invisible fire. A ring of black dust marked the stone floor around him. Yet there was not a single burn mark on the walls. Holmes moved slowly around the room, his lantern sweeping over books and tools, stopping at a table where an old paper lay half burned, its edges curled like dead leaves. On it, written in cramped, messy handwriting, were symbols, circles within circles crossed by lines and words in Latin that my schoolboy memory could barely remember. Aqua fortis, spiritus mercuri, Holmes whispered, translating softly. Old names for nitric acid and mercury. The man played at changing forms, but perhaps stumbled upon a discovery worth killing for. He knelt beside the body, lifting one blackened hand with his gloved fingers. Look, Watson, not the crispness of fire, but the breaking down of skin. This is chemical damage, not burning. He stood up, his eyes looking over the walls. And yet no bottle here could do that instantly unless ... His eyes fixed upon the furnace, where beneath the grate lay a broken melting pot and a dark dust that shined faintly, almost with rainbow colors. We shall have this tested, he said. But first, the door. Watson, you saw it was locked above? Yes. Holmes examined the hinges, then the bolts. A simple machine, yet ... He turned one screw, and the entire bar slipped free with tricky ease. Ah, it could be pulled shut from the outside with a hook or wire, clever and invisible to any normal eye. We heard then a sound above, the faint creak of a floorboard. Holmes's hand went to his revolver. Quiet, he whispered. There is someone still here. We froze, listening. A soft scrape, then silence. He signaled for me to turn off the lantern, and the darkness closed around us like a tomb. Through the gloom came the muffled sound of breathing just beyond the stairs. Holmes moved with cat-like grace, his outline barely more than a shadow among shadows. In a sudden burst of light, the door at the top flung open, and a figure darted out into the night. Holmes sprang after him, and I followed, my heart pounding. The fog swallowed all shapes within yards. Yet I heard the slap of boots on stone, and Holmes's low cry, "Stop! In the Queen's name!" When at last we reached the street, only emptiness remained. Emptiness and the faint echo of footsteps running away. Swallowed by the mist, Holmes stood still and listening, his breath white in the cold air. He knows what was done here, he said quietly, and he fears what we have already seen. He turned to me, his expression hard to read. This is no ordinary killing, Watson. The man we are chasing is either a genius or a ghost. And as we stood beneath the flickering gaslight, the fog wound itself around our feet like smoke from some unseen fire, as though the city itself plotted to hide its darkest secrets until the chosen time, the morning after our grim adventure found London wrapped in a blanket of mist that seemed unwilling to lift, as though the city itself was worrying about the crime. Holmes had slept little, if at all. When I woke up, he was already bent over his laboratory table, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the faint blue flame of a burner dancing in his eyes. On the surface before him lay a small glass bottle, filled with the dark dust he had gathered from the Alchemist's furnace. The air was thick with the mixed smells of acid and tobacco, and his violin rested untouched on the chair, as if music had run away before the importance of the investigation. He did not greet me, but merely held up the bottle between his thumb and finger, its contents shining faintly in the pale light. "Look, Watson," he said, "a substance unknown to the common chemist. It contains mercury, sulfur, and traces of arsenic, yet mixed in a way that goes against nature. I suspect it was part of an experiment, designed to speed up a reaction without flame in lesser hands. It becomes exactly what we saw last night, death by chemical damage." I walked closer, noticing the quiet focus in his eyes. Then Leighton died by his own invention? Perhaps, Holmes replied, his tone careful, or perhaps by the hand of another who understood its power better than he did. The question, Watson, is the reason. Why kill a man whose discoveries were of value to no one but himself? Unless... He paused, the faintest glimmer of a smile crossing his lips. Unless his alchemy was not as foolish as it looked. He turned to the table where Leighton's half-burned paper lay, carefully pressed between two sheets of glass. I have pieced together enough of his symbols to figure out his goal. Holmes continued. This was no mere playing with old superstition. He was attempting a change, not of metal, but of matter itself. A formula to dissolve and rebuild elements whenever he wanted. Imagine such power, Watson. To transform basic material without fire or time. It would make factories shake with fear. I looked at him in surprise. You cannot mean that such a thing is possible. Holmes smiled faintly. In theory, almost anything is possible, provided one is willing to pay the price. But the dead man discovered that price too late. Come, we must see the scene again, now that the body has been removed, and the daylight may show what the lamplight hid. By noon, we were once more in the narrow lane by the river, the fog giving way to a thin rain that blurred the outlines of the warehouse dot. The police officer on duty recognized us at once, and after a brief chat let us in. The cellar, though cleared out, kept its heavy feeling. The walls were wet with dampness, and the faint smell of burnt chemicals stayed, as if the air itself refused to forget. Holmes's lantern cast a moving circle of light across the stone floor. Notice, Watson, the lack of footprints between the furnace and the door, he said. The soot has not been touched. Therefore, the killer did not cross this space after the act. He was standing here near the steps when the experiment went wrong or succeeded beyond what was expected. He ran, locking the door behind him. He knelt, examining the ground with his magnifying glass. A smudge of wax, he whispered, scraping it carefully into a small tin. From a candle, perhaps, but mixed with something else. Chloride, judging by the feel. Strange. He stood up, his face thoughtful. Watson, bring the light closer to this wall. I did as he asked, and he pointed to a faint outline scratched into the plaster. A five-sided shape, drawn quickly in chalk dot inside its borders. Strange letters curled and looped like the work of a mad student. Alchemical signs, Holmes said quietly. But see how the lines shake and are uneven. They were drawn by a shaking hand. The murderer then, or Leighton himself, in his last moments. And here, a word half rubbed out. Sabeloft, does it mean anything to you? Nothing, I admitted. Nor to me, Holmes replied. Yet I bet it will prove to be the clue upon which this case turns. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. There is little more to be found here. Let us visit the widow. Her silence last night troubled me more than any word she spoke. The Leighton home stood a short distance away, an old brick house with vines climbing the walls like black. Vanes. Mrs. Leighton met us in a living room, covered in faded velvet and heavy with the smell of lavender. She was a middle-aged woman with eyes too dark and steady for one who had just lost her. Husband. Holmes bowed seriously. Madam, he said, I must interrupt your sadness to ask questions that may help bring justice to your late husband. She nodded her head slightly. If justice exists for him, Mr. Holmes, it is beyond the reach of this world. But ask what you must. Holmes's eyes wandered briefly to the fireplace, where a small brass melting pot sat polished and unused. Your husband was involved in experiments of great danger, he said. Did you know about the type of work he did? Her lips tightened. I knew only that it took up all his time. Day and night he worked in that awful cellar, speaking of metals and transformation, of victory over rotting and decay. He said he was close to a discovery. But discovery of what, I cannot tell. His mind had grown strange lately, fearful, secretive. There were nights he would not sleep, mumbling that someone was watching, that certain formulas had been stolen. Stolen? Holmes repeated. By whom? She shook her head. He would not say, only that he had once shared his ideas with a partner, a man of science who betrayed him. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A name, perhaps? None he ever spoke aloud, only that the man had hidden among chemists near Bishopsgate. Holmes walked slowly across the carpet, his fingers locked behind his back. You have been most helpful, madam. One last question. Did your husband keep any kind of record besides the book we found? She hesitated. He kept a journal, but it is missing. I discovered it gone the very night he died. Holmes nodded his head once more. Thank you, Mrs. Layton. I promise you I shall not rest until your husband's death is explained. Outside, the light rain had turned into a steady rain. Holmes pulled his collar up as we walked. The missing journal proves it, Watson. The killer's goal was not murder alone, but theft of knowledge. We must now find this mysterious partner near Bishopsgate. Yet before that, there is one more matter. The name Sablecraft. He stopped suddenly under the arch of a narrow alley and pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket. Look, he said, drawing the word in quick strokes. It could be a last name, though rare, or perhaps a place, a warehouse, a company. I shall check the phone books when we return. I offered to help, I said. Do so, Holmes replied. Meanwhile, I have another path to follow. The piece of glass we recovered from the cellar, it had a curve that didn't match any normal flask. Suspect it formed part of an optical lens, one used for focusing light or heat. If the alchemist's death was no accident, that lens may have served as the weapon. We returned to Baker Street by cab, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof, mixing with the clatter of hooves. Holmes sat in silence, his eyes half closed, fingers tapping against his knee in a restless rhythm. When at last we arrived, he went immediately to his files, pulling out a stack of notes yellowed with age. Here, he murmured, references to early experiments with concentrated chemical light, dangerous mixtures able to produce heat without flame. It was an idea, but never mastered. Layton may have succeeded. He paused, glancing toward me. If so, Watson, imagine what such a discovery could be worth on the market. The power to burn, melt, or clean metal with no coal, no fire. It would be worth a fortune to any factory business, and worth killing for. As evening got darker, Holmes lit his pipe and stood by the window, looking out upon the wet street. The alchemist's widow spoke the truth, he said softly. Someone was watching him, and that someone has his journal. Until we get it back, we are just blind men groping in smoke. I poured myself a cup of tea, more for warmth than thirst. Do you believe this partner will lead us to the truth? I believe he must, Holmes replied. But we must reach him before the journal changes hands. There are enough whispers in the criminal parts of London to suggest that secrets of such nature do not stay unbought for long. He turned suddenly, the energy of solving the puzzle lighting his face. Watson, tomorrow we go to Bishopsgate. There is a man there, Tobias Granger. Once a chemist kicked out of the Royal Society for bad practices. His name pops up wherever dangerous. Knowledge is sold. If Layton's killer is breathing. Granger will have heard of him. He drew the curtains and put out the lamp, the glow of his pipe the only light remaining. Sleep if you can, my dear fellow, he said, sitting down in the chair by the fireplace. For tomorrow we go down another step into the maze, and the shadows grow thicker the deeper one goes. Outside the rain whispered like the murmurs of invisible people. And somewhere far below the streets, the river splashed against its banks, as though echoing the beat of secrets that London never stops keeping. The next day started gray and tired, with the sort of light that seems filtered through wet cloth, pale, colorless, and unwilling to warm the earth. Holmes was already dressed and standing by the window when I entered the living room. His profile distinct. Against the glass streaked with fog dot on the table lay the morning copies of the Times and the Daily Telegraph. Both open to the inside columns dot. Each mentioned the alchemist's death by mysterious means, though neither came close to the truth of the matter. Holmes's face was unreadable as he read the headlines. Ben tossed them aside with quiet dislike. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The public, in its forever hunger for exciting stories, has turned our case into a fairy tale. One paper speaks of witchcraft, another of spontaneous combustion dot. It is amazing how quickly lack of knowledge grows when watered by fear." I smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the fear helps us. The killer may mistake the chaos for cover." "An excellent observation," Holmes replied, striking a match to light his pipe. "Yes, the greater the noise, the easier it is for one man to disappear. Yet even smoke leaves its mark, if one knows where to look." He took from the shelf a small glass jar, the piece of curved crystal we had taken from the cellar. "You see, Watson, last night I examined this under the lens dot. It is no mere bottle glass, but a part of a highly special instrument, a condenser used in experiments with light. Only a handful of men in London could build such a device. One of them lives in Bishopsgate." "Tobias Granger," I said, remembering his words from the evening before. "Exactly. Former teacher at the Polytechnic, fired for doing unapproved experiments involving unstable chemicals. Since then, he has made himself useful to certain less honest factory owners, providing them with inventions of questionable legality." Holmes slipped the glass into his pocket. "It is time we paid him a visit." The carriage carried us eastward through a waking city, along Fleet Street, past the towering church spires, half swallowed by mist, into that darker neighborhood where business fades and the air grows heavy with the smell of smoke and iron. Bishop's Gate stood at the border between respectability and ruin, its alleys crowded with metal shops, chemists' shops, and warehouses that seemed to lean upon one another for lack of space. Granger's address proved to be a low brick building marked by a crooked sign. T. Granger, Analytical Instruments. Inside, the shop was narrow and dim, cluttered with lenses, prisms, and clockwork machines whose purpose I could not guess. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man, tall but hunched over, his hair streaked with gray and his eyes bright with a kind of nervous intelligence. "Mr. Tobias Granger?" Holmes asked. The man's gaze flicked from Holmes to me and back again. "That is my name. You are Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We seek information concerning a certain Ambrose Leighton." At that, a shiver passed through Granger's face, a mere flicker, quickly hidden by an attempt to look calm. "Leighton? I have not heard that name in years. What of him?" "He is dead," Holmes said simply. "Found in his cellar 2 nights ago, the victim of a most strange accident." Granger's hand tightened on the counter. "Dead, you say? Dear me, I had heard rumors of an explosion by the river, but I did not imagine." He stopped, then added, "Forgive me, gentlemen, but my friendship with Mr. Leighton was of the most casual sort. We were colleagues once, long ago, when chemistry was a purer science." Holmes leaned lightly against a shelf of instruments. "And yet, I believe you wrote to each other until recently. Your handwriting, Mr. Granger, is quite distinct, particularly the curl of your capital G. I observed it upon a label stuck to a condenser recovered from the scene." Granger's calm faltered. "You accuse me?" "I state only that your work was present in a place of death," Holmes said evenly. "Whether by coincidence or plan remains to be seen." The chemist's lips twitched into something looking like a smile. "Mr. Holmes, you may read the shape of a man's boot from the depth of a footprint, but you read his soul too easily. I supplied Mr. Layton with equipment years ago. Nothing more, if he misused them. The fault lies not in the maker. Holmes looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "Do you know the word sablecraft?" The question struck like a blow. Granger's eyes widened, not in fake surprise, but in real alarm. "Where did you hear that?" He whispered. "From Layton's own hand. Does it mean a place?" Granger hesitated, his glance darting toward the curtained doorway at the back of the shop. "You would do well to forget that name," he mumbled. "Nothing good ever came of it, If Layton wrote it, then he was more tangled up than I knew. Lead it be, Mr. Holmes, for both your sakes." Holmes stood up straight, his voice cool and deliberate. "You are holding back information that may concern a man's murder. I cannot promise you safety should you continue in silence." Granger's shoulders slumped. "You do not understand. There are those in London who seek power through knowledge best, left untouched. They called themselves the Circle of Sablecraft. Scientists, bankers, even men of Parliament. Layton once dreamed of joining them. When they threw him out, he swore revenge. I warned him to abandon his obsession, but he would not listen. And what was the Circle's purpose? Experiments. Transformation. They sought to perfect a process for cleaning metals beyond purity, for creating an element no furnace could withstand. They believed it would change the world. He looked up, his eyes haunted. Or destroy it. Holmes's expression hardened. "You were one of them." "I was briefly, until I saw what it cost. When their experiments began to hurt people, I left, but they would not let me go. They never do." The shop's bell rang suddenly as a customer entered, and Granger jumped like a man who had been hit. Holmes turned quietly, pretending to inspect a prism, while Granger served the stranger. A big fellow with a worker's cap had a faint scar across his jaw. The deal was brief, a whispered word, an exchange of coins, and the man left as swiftly as he came. When the door had closed, Holmes said quietly, "You are being watched, Mr. Granger." Granger nodded grimly. "They fear I may talk. You see now why I hesitate." Holmes drew from his coat a small card and placed it upon the counter. "If you value your life, send word to Baker Street the moment you learn more. I advise you not to remain here after dark." As we left the shop, I glanced back to see Granger standing motionless in the doorway, his face pale against the gloom. Holmes said nothing until we were once more in the cab, then blew out a thin cloud of smoke. "The Circle of Sablecraft," he mused. "An organization wrapped in secrecy, its name written in chalk upon a dead man's wall. Curious indeed. Do you believe his story?" I asked. "In part. Fear lends truth a sharper edge. Yet Granger knows more than he dares speak. We must move quickly, Watson, for silence of that kind does not live long." The carriage rattled past the crowded markets, and as we turned into Holborn, Holmes drew a folded scrap from his pocket. "While you talked with the police officer yesterday, I asked about Layton's money dealings. Look at this receipt from a warehouse in Bishopsgate. Payment for metal samples to be delivered to an address signed SC. What if Sablecraft were not merely a name, but an abbreviation? Then there may be a place or a person hidden behind the initials," I said. "Exactly. And if so, that place will hold what the widow's house and the cellar do not: the motive." We reached Baker Street as twilight fell, the lamplighters moving along the sidewalk like ghosts. Holmes sent the cab away and strode into our rooms without a word. He sat himself at the table, fingers pressed together in that familiar pose of deep thought. "Watson," he said at last, "send a telegram to Lestrade at Scotland Yard. Tell him to ask if any buildings in Bishopsgate have been rented under the name Skay or Sablecraft in the past year." I did so at once. While we waited, Holmes returned to the window, pipe glowing faintly in the dim light. The minutes stretched into an hour before the reply came. A knock at the door and a messenger, breathless from the cold. Holmes tore open the envelope and scanned the contents. "Ah," he murmured. "As I expected, there is indeed such a place. A warehouse registered 6 months ago under the firm, Sablecraft & Co., Metal Refiners. Its address, Watson, lies scarcely 2 streets from Granger's workshop." He folded the telegram with care. "Our next destination is set. Outside, the bells of St. Botolph's rang 6. Holmes put out his pipe, the faint glow fading like the last spark of a furnace. "We go tonight," he said. "While the city sleeps, the truth works by lamplight. And I mean to catch it in the act." He reached for his hat and revolver. And as we stepped once more into the thickening fog, I could not shake the chill that settled upon me. The feeling that the darkness ahead was not merely of night, but as something older, heavier, and far less forgiving than time itself. Night had folded itself over London by the time we reached the district of Bishop's Gate once more. The fog hung in heavy clouds, clinging to the roofs like gauze and swallowing the flicker of the gas lamps, until each became no more than a shaking ball suspended in gloom. The streets were nearly empty. Only the echo of our footsteps disturbed the silence as we approached the warehouse registered under the firm of Sablecraft & Co. Metal Refiners. It stood back from the street, its windows black and unlit, the iron shutters closed and bolted. Yet through a narrow crack between them, a faint glow pulsed, not the steady light of a lamp, but a rhythmic shimmer, cold and unnatural, as if the heart of the place beat with some secret energy. Holmes paused, studying the front of the building with the eye of a surgeon about to make a cut. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "The door has no padlock, only a bolt from within. That suggests someone is inside despite the hour. Whatever trade this business conducts, it is not meant for daylight." We walked along the side alley, our boots brushing against puddles that reflected the dim gleam of the street lamps. Holmes crouched near a drainage vent and drew from his pocket a thin piece of wire which he put delicately between the iron bars. "A simple lock," he whispered. "The work of a man who fears break-ins but trusts too much in darkness." With a soft click, the latch opened, and he motioned for me to follow. The inside was huge and hollow, its floor covered with crates, sacks, and instruments half covered in canvas. The air smelled of oil and scorched metal. From somewhere deeper, inside came that same pulsing light we had seen from the street, rising and falling, as though alive. Holmes moved silently ahead, his outline barely more than a shadow against the gloom. I followed close, revolver in hand. We came out into a smaller room divided by wooden beams. At its center stood a furnace unlike any I'd seen, built not of brick, but of polished steel, with tubes and coils spreading from its center like the ribs of some monster art. Upon a nearby table lay open record books, each page full of numbers and strange notes. Holmes leaned over them, the flicker of light painting his face in gold and blue. "These are no business accounts," he said softly. "They record measurements, heat, pressure, times of reaction. The handwriting. However, double quotes." He trailed off and looked up at me. "Compare, Watson, to the samples we took from Layton's book. Do you see the similarity?" I looked closely. The letters were the same, slanted, narrow. The pen strokes quick and nervous. "Then this is his work," I said. "His, or that of the man who stole it." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Either way, this place is the continuation of his cellar, perfected under another hand. Note too the label upon these cans, Spiritus Mercuri, the same term found upon Layton's paper. The experiment lives on." At that instant, a sound broke the silence. The faint scrape of metal against stone somewhere in the shadows. Beyond. Holmes put out his lantern and pulled me behind a stack of crates. Footsteps approached, cautious but deliberate. A figure entered the room, tall and thin, wrapped in a dark overcoat. He carried a small oil lamp, whose flame shook upon a face, half hidden by the brim of a hat. Holmes's whisper reached my ear. "We shall see who dares the furnace at midnight." The stranger crossed to the table, searching through the books. His movements were fast, purposeful. He tore a page free, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. Then, as he turned, the lamplight fell full upon his face. I caught my breath. It was Tobias Granger. Holmes stepped out of the shadow. "Good evening, Mr. Granger," he said calmly. The man started violently, nearly dropping his lamp. "Holmes, for God's sake, you should not be here." "Nor you," Holmes returned, his tone still mild. "We left you in safety this afternoon. Yet here you stand in the middle of the very machinery of murder. Have you come to get back what you sold, or to ensure it remains hidden?" Granger's face was pale. "You do not understand. I came only to destroy it before they use it again." "They?" Holmes repeated. "The circle of sablecraft, I assume." Granger nodded weakly. "Leighton's discovery. It was no mere chemical accident. He achieved what they sought, the breaking down of base metals into pure element, an energy that eats without flame. But when he refused to share his formula, they turned against him. I warned him, Holmes. I begged him to run, but he thought himself safe in his cellar. I never dreamed they would." He broke off, shivering. Holmes's gaze softened, but his voice remained cold. "You mean to say the circle murdered him?" "Yes," Granger whispered. "And now they mean to continue his work. The formula is incomplete, but they have enough to rebuild it. I came tonight to burn the books, to destroy every trace before they return." "Then we share a goal," Holmes said. "But tell me, who leads this circle now?" Granger hesitated. "You would not believe me. I have made a job of believing the improbable." The chemist took a shaking breath. "A man named Silas Canning, once a banker, now something else. He pays for the experiments, protects the society with his influence. He met Leighton years ago and wanted his knowledge. It was he who gave the name Sablecraft to their business." Before Holmes could reply, a sudden noise rang out. The creak of a hinge, the hiss of a door flung open. Voices echoed down the hallway, harsh and urgent. "They're here," Granger hissed. "They know." Holmes seized my arm. "This way, Watson." Behind the furnace. We ducked into the narrow gap between the machine and the wall as two men entered, their faces hidden by scarves. One carried a lantern, the other revolver. They advanced cautiously, the beam of light sweeping the room. "Granger," one called, "you've taken long enough." The chemist stepped forward, trembling but defiant. "I came to finish it," he said. "To end this madness." The man with the gun laughed. "End it? Not while there's profit left in it." Holmes pressed a finger to his lips, motioning me to stay silent. I could see his eyes fixed upon the furnace, calculating distance and chance. The armed man pointed to the other. "Seal the door. We'll deal with him quick." In that moment, Holmes moved. With the swiftness of a striking cat, he sprang from hiding. Knocking the lantern from the man's hand, it shattered upon the floor, plunging the room into chaos. I fired once into the darkness. A warning shot, and the gunman's reply tore through the air, inches from my shoulder. Granger cried out as a blow struck him, and the sound of struggle filled the room. Then came a roar, deep, booming, and terrible. The furnace flared to sudden life, flooding the room with blinding light. One of the intruders screamed as the heat struck him. He staggered backward, clawing at his face, and fell among the crates, The other fled toward the outer door, which Holmes reached in a single bound, slamming it shut before the man could escape. When the light died down, the room lay in ruin, smoke curling from the shattered glass, the air thick with the metallic smell of burned mercury. Granger lay upon the floor, clutching his arm, which bled freely from a shallow wound. Holmes helped him stand up. "You are lucky, sir," he said. "Had that bullet struck higher, your confession might have died with you." Granger's voice was rough. "You must stop them. Holmes, canning. He plans to sell the formula abroad. There's a meeting 2 nights from now at a house by the Strand. They will exchange the journal there." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Then we have our next destination." He turned to me. "Watson, see to his arm. I shall send for Lestrade to take what remains of this place into custody. We can leave nothing to chance." Outside, the fog had thickened once more, wrapping the world in silence. As we came out from the warehouse, Granger leaned heavily on my arm, his face pale beneath the gaslight. Holmes paused upon the doorstep and looked back at the darkened building. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "how knowledge, when pursued without a conscience, becomes a weapon more deadly than steel. Tonight we have seen only the opening. The real play begins on the Strand." We hailed a cab and set off through the sleeping city. The rain had begun again. Fine, steady, relentless. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his eyes fixed on the blurred reflection of the lamps upon the wet pavement. "The circle moved swiftly," he murmured. "Too swiftly. They've killed once to guard their secret. They will not hesitate again. We must reach the Strand before the journal changes hands, before London itself becomes the melting pot for their experiment." And so we drove on through the rain, the cab wheels hissing over the stones, until the lights of Baker Street appeared from the fog like faint stars breaking through a storm. Yet even there, within the familiar walls of our living room, I could not shake the vision of that furnace, the pulse of its light, the sound of its breathing, nor the dreadful thought that somewhere in the depths of the city, others were even now preparing to wake it once more. The following day dawned with a kind of fake calm, the sky clear, the air washed clean by the night's rain, as if the city had forgotten the evil that had breathed within its streets. Yet Holmes, always distrustful of fair weather, stood by the fireplace in a mood of cold focus. His violin lay untouched upon the table, and beside it, scattered in careful order, were the leftovers of our investigation: a folded telegram, the torn ledger page found at the warehouse, and a small glass vial still faintly shining with metallic dust. "Watson," he said, turning sharply, "our enemy's hand moves faster than the Yard's imagination. Lestrade will arrive soon, but we cannot rely upon official channels. We must act as though we are alone in this." "I have seldom seen you so serious," I replied. "Because, my dear fellow, the seriousness is real. You heard Granger's words. There is to be a meeting on the Strand 2 nights from now. But consider this. Canning and his partners have already destroyed one man to silence him, and they will surely destroy another to secure their secret. If they succeed in selling Leighton's formula to foreign interests, the consequences could reach beyond London, beyond England itself." Before I could answer, a sharp knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, hat in hand, his expression showing both curiosity and tiredness. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson, I've been over that warehouse you mentioned. Nasty business, Doc. We found one man dead, burnt, though there was no fire, and another gone missing. No sign of this Granger you spoke of either." Holmes's brow wrinkled. "Gone? Vanished between the time you left him and the constable's arrival? There was blood on the floor, but not enough to suggest he died. I bet he's in hiding." Holmes drew a long breath. "Then the circle works swiftly indeed. They've either taken him or silenced him. Lestrade, I want a careful watch placed upon every boarding house near the river. He will surface if he lives. Lestrade nodded. And what of this Mr. Canning? Shall I bring him in for questioning? Holmes shook his head. Not yet. To strike too early would send the others underground. Let them gather, and we shall be among them. When the inspector had gone, Holmes crossed to his desk and began to write quickly upon a slip of paper. A note to an old friend, he said, handing it to me. Langley of the Strand Theatre. The Circle's meeting, I'm convinced, will take place in one of the houses next to it. I shall need access to the neighboring building. And Langley owes me a favor. The day passed in restless preparation. Holmes spent hours at his chemistry bench, testing dusts and mixtures, muttering under his breath about mercury vapors and light ignition. I busied myself in gathering the revolvers, securing lanterns, and ensuring that our carriage would be ready at a moment's notice. By dusk, Holmes at last straightened, his face pale but determined. It is ready, he murmured, holding up a thin vial of clear fluid, a neutralizing agent. Should they attempt to use Layton's process, this will stop the reaction instantly. A matter of seconds may stand between us and disaster. We ate dinner quickly, and as twilight deepened, a messenger arrived, bearing a reply from Mr. Langley. Holmes's request had been granted. The adjoining warehouse, once a prop storage building, was ours for the evening. From there we might observe the meeting unseen. At 9 o'clock exactly we set out, the fog thick once more, muffling the hooves of the cab horse and casting the lamps into halos. The Strand lay alive with the bustle of late, theater-goers and the soft clatter of carriages. Amidst that crowd, no one would have taken notice of two gentlemen getting out near a shuttered warehouse. We slipped inside, closing the door behind us, and climbed to the upper floor. The room was dusty, smelling faintly of old paint and rotting wood. Through a narrow crack in the wall, we could see into the adjoining building. It was a large room, dimly lit by oil lamps, and heavy with tobacco smoke. Around a long table sat 6 men, their faces shadowed, but their postures clearly alert. At the head, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight, sat a man whose manner spoke of wealth and power. Silas Canning. Holmes's breath caught softly beside me. There he is, Watson, the alchemist of money. See how easily smarts and greed make a team. The men spoke in low voices, and though the words reached us faintly, we could understand their meaning. One of them produced a small leather case and placed it before Canning. From within he drew a packet of papers. Layton's journal beyond doubt. Holmes's hand gripped my arm. There, Watson, the prize itself. Canning unfolded the pages with delicate care. Gentlemen, he said, his voice cold, deliberate, with the authority of one used to giving orders. Layton's notes are complete. The formula is intact. Once refined, it will create a substance capable of transforming metal at room temperature. An energy source without coal, without flame. The age of alchemy has returned, and we shall be its masters. A murmur of approval swept the table. Another man asked, "And what of the authorities?" "The papers speak of investigation." "Holmes," Canning sneered faintly, "let him chase shadows. By the time he reaches us, the formula will already be on its way across the channel. There are men in Berlin who will pay for such knowledge in gold. In favors, in silence." Holmes's face had gone utterly still. He leaned closer to the crack. "Do you hear, Watson? Industrial spying wrapped in the clothes of science. They mean to sell England's future." Then came the sound of footsteps in the hall below, heavy, purposeful. A door opened and another man entered the room. The others rose slightly, their expressions shifting from confidence to worry. It was Tobias Granger. He looked deadly pale, his left arm tied in a rough sling. "I told you this would happen," he rasped. You've spilled blood for knowledge you cannot control. Leighton's process is death. It cannot be contained. Canning's eyes narrowed. You were warned to remain silent, Mr. Granger, and you were warned that the reaction feeds upon itself. Granger cried. Even now, the residue from Leighton's cellar eats the air. It cannot be stored, cannot be moved. If you attempt to reproduce it, it will eat everything it touches. Holmes drew in a sharp breath. Watson, if he speaks truth... But Canning had risen, his voice cutting through the tension. Enough. You will sign this paper, Granger, swearing that the formula is safe or by heaven. He gestured, and one of his men stepped forward, revolver drawn. Holmes's hand went to his own weapon. We must act now. Before I could reply, he was already moving, forcing open the door and striding into the adjoining room. The men at the table jumped to their feet as we burst through the inner doorway. Gentlemen, Holmes said coldly, revolver steady. I regret to interrupt your experiment in treason, but the laboratory is closed. The scene that followed was chaos. Canning shouted for his men to grab him. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Granger stumbled backward, knocking over the table. Papers flew, a lamp fell over, and in an instant the tablecloth had caught fire. The fire spread swiftly across the oil-stained floorboards. Feeding hungrily upon the air, Holmes sprang toward the papers, grabbing the journal, even as the heat licked his sleeve. Watson, the window! He cried. Together, we smashed it open, the night air rushing in with a gust of smoke. Canning lunged, grappling for the journal, but Holmes struck him squarely across the wrist. The older man stumbled, his face twisted with fury. You fool! He spat. You think you can stop progress? Progress without a conscience is decay, Holmes returned, his voice like ice. The fire roared between us, the heat fierce enough to drive us back, through the smoke. I saw Granger grab the vial Holmes had prepared. Throwing it into the flames, there was a sudden hiss, a shock of blinding light, and then silence. The fire died down, the air heavy with a sharp smell of acid. Holmes and I dragged Granger to the window as the remaining men ran into the fog. Outside, the crowd had gathered, drawn by the explosion. Lestrade's voice rose above the noise. Holmes, what the devil? No time for questions, Holmes called, pulling Granger through the window. The building is unsafe. We stumbled into the street, just as the upper floor gave way. A huge cloud of smoke pouring skyward. The Strand blazed red against the fog, and for a moment the whole city seemed to flicker with it. A brief, terrible vision of what might have been. When the fire was at last put out and Canning taken into custody, Holmes stood apart from the crowd, his face gray with exhaustion. It is over, I said gently. He shook his head. No, Watson. The circle of Sablecraft is wounded, not destroyed. There are others behind Canning. Names we have not yet heard, but tonight at least, the formula dies with the fire. He turned his gaze toward the smoking ruin. Leighton sought to master transformation, and in doing so, transformed himself into the very thing he feared. Let us hope London learns from his mistake. As the dawn broke once more over the blackened remains of the Strand, the light caught the drifting smoke and turned it briefly to gold, a passing alchemy of its own. Holmes watched it in silence, and I, seeing the tiredness in his eyes, thought that for once even he might feel the weight of the knowledge he so relentlessly pursued. The following morning found Holmes seated at the table, a thin line of smoke curling from his pipe, his gaze fixed not upon the papers spread before him, but upon some invisible horizon known only to his thoughts. The air in Baker Street was heavy with the smell of the previous nights. Disaster. The scent of scorched wood and burnt oil still clung to our coats. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Familiar rattle of carriages, the cry of the newspaper boys, the ordinary hum of London life continuing its rhythm while the ashes of the Strand still smoked. Granger had been taken to the hospital under police guard, his arm bandaged and his mind shaking between relief and confusion. Canning, the money man of the circle, lay in custody at Scotland Yard, maintaining a silence so absolute that Lestrade had sent word he doubted the man would speak at all. Yet Holmes, for all his calm look, seemed unsettled, not with the crime, but with the silence that followed it. "There is a strange stillness after the storm," he said at last, as though answering my unspoken thought. "A sense that what remains unseen is bigger than what has been destroyed. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of the fact that Canning, when arrested, carried not the formula itself, but only pieces of Leighton's notes?" I thought about it. "Then someone else must hold the rest." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. And that is where our danger lies. The circle was not a single snake, but a nest. Cut off the head, and another rises from the coil. The question is, who among them escaped the Strand last night?" Before I could reply, there came a knock, and Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram upon a tray. Holmes tore it open, his eyes flicking rapidly over the words. "From Lestrade," he murmured. "They have found something. A body pulled from the river near Blackfriars Bridge. The face damaged, but the pocket contained a calling card. Tobias Granger." I rose in astonishment. "Then he is dead?" "So it would appear," Holmes said grimly, rising to fetch his coat. "But I will not believe it until I have seen the body with my own eyes. Come, Watson. The truth seldom floats for long in the Thames." The morgue lay in a dreary wing of the hospital, its stone floor slippery with wetness, and the chill of early fog seeping through the walls. Lestrade awaited us there, his manner quiet. "You'll forgive the early call, gentlemen," he said, "but the case takes on a fresh shape. The man was found at dawn, tangled in the posts below the bridge, weighted down, but the rope had frayed. His injuries suggest a fight before death." Holmes drew back the sheet that covered the body. What remained of the face was messed up by river damage. Yet the hair, the height, the shape of the hands, all matched Granger's description. Holmes examined the wrists, the torn cuffs, the bruising along the neck. "Yes," he said softly, "strangled from behind, likely by two men. And note, Watson, the burn mark upon his forearm. It is the same wound he had when we last saw him. This is Granger indeed." Lestrade nodded grimly. "He must have been followed from the Strand. We've no doubt the circle wanted him silenced for good. Yet," Holmes said, "it is curious that they chose the river. A man so easily lost and found. A message perhaps to others who might think to speak." He turned from the table, his expression unreadable. "Has Canning been told?" "No," Lestrade replied. "He keeps to himself, neither arguing nor confessing, only stares through the wall as if counting the bricks." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "He knows more than silence can protect. Keep him under guard, Lestrade, and have every officer along the docks instructed to watch for men bearing signs of chemical burns. The formula, if divided, must have been passed by hand, and such work leaves its mark. We left the morgue beneath a sky as gray as the river itself. The fog thickened once more, swallowing the outlines of the city, as though London wished to hide its own guilt. For a time we walked in silence. Then Holmes spoke again, his tone lower, thoughtful. "It is a grim irony, Watson. Leighton, who sought to change matter, has himself become changed from scientist to myth. Even in death, his name draws men like moths to a flame. And now one more has burned." By evening, we were back in Baker Street. Holmes had spread the pieces of Leighton's record book across the floor, arranging each fragment like a puzzle. "See here," he said, pointing to a series of figures. These are temperature numbers, but there are mistakes. Note this mark. It is a correction made by another hand, less precise. Granger's, perhaps, or someone else who attempted to continue the work. He rose abruptly and crossed to the window. Do you recall, Watson, the faint humming sound Phelps described that first night in the cellar? Indeed, he said it was like a tuning fork, faint but dreadful. Exactly. Such a sound suggests electrical energy, not merely chemical. I believe Leighton's process required both elements, reaction and current. He was not merely dissolving metals, but altering their makeup through controlled vibration. That, Watson, is the missing piece. I frowned. But who would have the knowledge to copy such a thing now? Holmes turned, the lamplight glinting in his eyes. There is only one man in London with the means and the daring. Professor Mortimer Vail. The name stirred a memory. The scientist fired from the Royal Institute for fake experiments? The same. He was once Canning's partner in a business venture. Their partnership ended when Vail's theories grew too dangerous for public showing. If Canning was the money, Vail was the brain. And if the circle survives, it is Vail who leads it now. The rest of the night was spent in preparation. Holmes wrote 3 telegrams, one to Lestrade, another to the Yard's chemical division, and a third to a mystery person, whose name he did not share out shortly before dawn. He turned to me. We go to the river again. Watson Vail will not hide in offices or boardrooms. He will seek loneliness, a laboratory perhaps in the abandoned, tunnels beneath the old docks, the sort of place where a man may risk discovery without fear of witnesses. We took a cab as far as the Blackfriars Steps, then descended into the damp air along the riverbank. The tide was low, revealing slippery stones and the rotted skeletons of old piers. Holmes moved with quiet purpose, his lantern casting narrow circles of light. You see, he murmured, the pattern continues. Fire, water, transformation, the Alchemist's 3. We reached a half-collapsed archway where the bricks were stained black with age. Holmes knelt, running his hand over the ground. Fresh tracks. 2 men, perhaps 3 within the last hour. Come inside. The passage wound downward into darkness. The smell was awful damp stone, oil, and something sharp that burned the throat. We followed the tunnel until it opened into a large room lit by a single hanging lamp. Beneath it stood a table crowded with instruments. Glass tubes, coils of wire, and a large round container humming faintly with energy. And there, bent over the machine, was a man, tall, thin, his hair wild and silver, his face drawn with the passion of obsession. He turned as we entered, and I recognized the mad gleam in his eyes from the sketches I had once seen in the papers. Professor Vail, Holmes said evenly, your reputation comes before you. The man smiled thinly. Mr. Holmes, I wondered when you would come. You are too late. Leighton's work lives again. He gestured toward the cylinder, where a faint blue light shimmered within. The reaction has begun. Do you hear it? The vibration of matter itself, singing its new form into being. Shut it down, Holmes commanded. You know not what you unleash. Vail laughed softly. Ignorance is the sin of lesser men. I am creating purity, a world without waste, without decay. Leighton was too scared to see it through. But I... Holmes moved forward, revolver drawn, while I reached for the nearest valve. Vail's eyes blazed. Touch it, Doctor, and you will unmake yourself. In that instant, the cylinder pulsed violently, the light within brightening to a blinding glare. Holmes seized the vial from his pocket, the neutralizing agent he had prepared, and threw it against the base of the machine. There was a hiss, a burst of white vapor, and the humming stopped. The air hung still, heavy with sharp smoke. Vale stood frozen, his expression twisted between awe and fury. "You've undone it," he whispered. "Do you understand what you've destroyed?" "A horror," Holmes replied. "London thanks you for your silence." The man sagged, trembling, then slumped to the ground as the blue light died away entirely. Holmes bent to inspect the machine, his voice low. "It was close, Watson. A fraction more, and the city above us would have glowed like a furnace. We left the tunnels as dawn broke, the light gray and clean upon the river once more." Holmes did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was with a tiredness rare in his voice. "The pursuit of knowledge, Watson, is like the pursuit of fire noble in origin, fatal in excess. Leighton, Canning, Vale, all sought to change the world, and each was consumed by the very principle he worshipped." He glanced eastward, where the first rays of sunlight struck the mist above the water, turning it gold for an instant before fading again to silver. "So ends the alchemist's dream," he murmured, "and once more the city sleeps, never knowing how near it came to burning." 2 days passed before Holmes emerged from the silence into which he had fallen after the fight, beneath the wall. During that time, the newspapers were filled with confusion. First, reports of a mysterious explosion near Blackfriars, then takebacks, then whispers of chemical smuggling found in the river tunnels. Yet nowhere was there mention of Professor Vale, nor of the circle of sablecraft. The case, it seemed, had already begun to sink beneath the surface of public memory, as if London itself preferred not to look too closely at what had been dragged up from its depths. I found Holmes at last seated by the fire, his robe loosely tied, a violin resting across his knees. The room was unusually messy. Papers lay scattered over the floor, and the faint smell of acid hung in the air from some midnight experiment. He was staring not at his instrument, but at a folded copy of the Times. "The world has a talent for forgetting, Watson," he said without looking up. "It remembers scandal, but not salvation. Note here, mysterious fire on the Strand, pushed to the second column beneath an ad for hair tonic. Such is the city's gratitude." I smiled faintly. "I thought you cared little for gratitude." "Not caring is one thing," Holmes replied. "Erasing is another. These men sought to unmake nature itself, and London will never know how near it came to joining them in the furnace." He paused, then looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen, a kind of inward heaviness. "And yet I cannot dismiss the feeling that we have only dimmed the flame, not put it out." He tossed the paper aside and rose abruptly. "Lestrade called earlier. Canning refuses all food, all speech, but there is something curious. An anonymous letter was delivered to the yard this morning. No address, no signature. Only a single line. The circle breathed still. The words lingered between us like a cold draught. Then Vale was not alone," I said quietly. Holmes shook his head. "No man ever builds an empire of knowledge without followers. Vale's death or disappearance, for we have yet confirm either, will not halt them. The circle survives, perhaps broken, perhaps reborn." He moved toward the window, where the pale autumn light glimmered weakly through the fog. "And where there is survival, there will be movement. The press will feel it first." He was right. That afternoon, a young journalist from the Strand magazine arrived at Baker Street. A nervous fellow named Edmund Kirk, hat clutched in hand, eyes darting with the eagerness of youth and ambition. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I come at the request of my editor. We have heard rumors dot. There is talk in Fleet Street of a secret scientific society broken up by Scotland Yard. They say you are involved." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Rumor is the first shelter of ignorance, Mr. Kirk. Yet I suspect you would not have risked disturbing my morning if your story rested only on whispers." Kirk blushed. "A man came to our offices last night, sir," He carried an envelope sealed with black wax, marked with a circle enclosing the letter S. Inside were pages, scientific notes signed by Ambrose Leighton. He claimed they were part of a larger book, one that would restore the truth. Before we could question him further, he vanished. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Describe him. Tall, thin, a foreign accent, German, perhaps. His hands were stained with what looked like soot or chemicals. Did he leave an address? None, only that he would return within 2 days to collect payment for the exclusive rights. Holmes paced, his long fingers pressed together before him. So the fragments resurface, the circle scatters, yet each seeks profit from the ashes. They mean to rebuild Leighton's work through the press, to draw new minds into their design under the mask of scientific curiosity. Kirk hesitated. Should I give the papers to the authorities? Holmes shook his head. No, let them remain in your office. Tomorrow evening, when your mysterious visitor returns, I shall be waiting in your editor's place. Watson will accompany me. You may tell no one of our arrangement. The young man nodded eagerly and left. When the door had closed, Holmes turned to me. You see, Watson, how swiftly intellect turns to sickness. The circle feeds upon the very curiosity it corrupts. It is time we saw its infection with our own eyes. The following night, as the clock struck 8, we found ourselves in the editorial rooms at the Strand magazine. The building stood at the corner of Burleigh Street, its windows overlooking the busy road. Holmes had hidden himself behind a tall cabinet near the entrance, while I waited by the desk with Mr. Kirk, who appeared pale but determined. Upon the desk lay the envelope with its black seal. The hours dragged. Outside, the city's pulse slowed to its night rhythm. The rattle of the last cabs, the cry of the newsboys fading into the distance at last. Shortly after 11, footsteps echoed in the corridor. A man entered, closing the door softly behind him. He was indeed tall and thin, with a narrow face and restless eyes that gleamed like steel beneath the brim of his hat. You have the papers? He asked, his accent sharp and foreign. Kirk nodded, sliding the envelope forward. They are here, but my editor insists on confirming your identity before we proceed. The man smiled faintly. Identity is a luxury, my friend. In our work, names are shadows. Payment, however, is light. He extended his hand. £10, as agreed. Payment, Holmes said from the shadows, is the last step in any honest transaction. But honesty is not what you seek, is it? The stranger spun around, his hand darting beneath his coat. Holmes was faster in a single stride. He seized the man's wrist and twisted a small revolver free. I would advise against drama, he said coldly. Now, let us have the truth. For a moment, the man's expression flickered between fear and defiance. You cannot stop it, he spat. The work continues. Leighton's design will live again. Already others rebuild what you destroyed. The circle is no longer kept to London. Holmes's voice was like steel. Who leads it? Names mean nothing, the man sneered. But the next experiment begins soon in Paris. There are factories waiting, rich supporters eager. You may kill one idea, Mr. Holmes, but not the hunger that drives it. At Holmes's signal, I retrieved the envelope from the desk. Inside were sheets covered in dense formulas and notes. In 2 distinct hands, Holmes examined them briefly. His brow wrinkled. These are incomplete copies, he said. Not enough to reproduce the reaction, but enough to inspire further madness. Watson, destroy them. The stranger lunged forward with a cry. I stepped between them, striking his arm aside. The fight was brief. Holmes held him down with the effortless precision of a man long accustomed to using force efficiently. Moments later, Lestrade, who had been waiting in the street below, entered with 2 constables to take the man into custody. When all was quiet again, Kirk turned to us, trembling. "Mr. Holmes, what was it he meant? Will this go beyond England?" Holmes looked toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like pale breath. "Ideas have no borders, Mr. Kirk. They move through minds as easily as air through the lungs. Leighton's dream has escaped its vessel, and the circle, though wounded, will seek new ground. But for now, London sleeps easier." We left the office in silence. The rain had begun again, falling softly upon the LAMPL IGHT dot as we walked back toward Charing Cross. Holmes spoke at last. "Do you recall, Watson, when I said that knowledge without conscience becomes its own sickness? The circle understands that truth better than most. They no longer need laboratories. They require only believers." He paused beneath a street lamp, its light catching the sharp angle of his cheek. "If this infection spreads to the continent, others will take up the experiment under new banners. Progress, discovery, enlightenment. Words, Watson, can disguise any horror if one chooses the right tone." We continued on in silence until Baker Street rose before us out of the mist, familiar and strangely fragile amidst the chaos of the city. Holmes removed his hat and stood a moment in the doorway, listening to the distant echo of hooves upon the wet cobbles. "The circle breathes still," he murmured almost to himself. "And so it seems must I." He stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me to wonder whether the fog that swirled about London that night was not merely weather, but the visible breath of secrets refusing to die. The dawn that followed was colorless, and Baker Street lay under a quiet that felt almost sad. The fog had thinned into a pale veil over the rooftops. Yet even the sparrows seemed quiet, their morning chatter replaced by silence. Holmes sat at the breakfast table, the untouched toast growing cold upon the plate before him. While I scanned the morning copy of the Times, his violin lay across the arm of his chair, the bow balanced loosely between his fingers. Though no music came, he was not sulking exactly. Holmes never sulked, but there was a peculiar stillness about him, like a hunter stopped mid-jump, sensing a change in the wind. "Nothing of importance," I reported at last, folding the paper. "The press mentions last night's arrest only in passing. They call it an international smuggling case, not a whisper of Leighton, the circle, or anything resembling truth." Holmes breathed out softly, as if unsurprised. The world rarely prints what it cannot understand. When fact sounds like fiction, it is dismissed as fantasy. His gaze drifted toward the window. And yet the hand that silences truth often shakes when it writes lies. He rose abruptly and crossed to his desk, where a pile of mail awaited him. With his usual precision, he began to sort through the envelopes, discarding most without a glance. Then his hand paused upon one, cream-colored, sealed in red wax. Stamped with a faint circular symbol dot, he studied it in silence before breaking the seal. "Watson," he said, his tone low, "our enemies show a flair for drama." The note within was written in elegant, almost delicate handwriting. "Mr. Holmes, the fire upon the Strand was but a spark. The true furnace burns elsewhere. If you would put it out, come to Charing Cross at midnight. Look for the man with the silver cufflinks. A friend of the truth." I frowned. "A trap, surely." "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied, his eyes brightening with that peculiar gleam that signaled renewed purpose. "But even traps reveal their makers. A man invites me into the fire, and I intend to see whose hand feeds it." Throughout the day, Holmes prepared with careful calm. He examined his revolver, adjusted the hidden blade within his walking stick, and placed a small vial, the neutralizing agent he had perfected, inside his vest. When evening came, he refused supper, contenting himself with coffee and silence. At 11:45, we hailed a cab and rode through the sleeping city. The fog had returned thicker than before, its tendrils swirling beneath the gas lamps, like the slow breaths of the Thames. Charing cross lay quiet, save for a few late travelers and the occasional clatter of a distant cab. Holmes scanned the crowd with the sharpness of a hawk. "There," he murmured, "by the bookstore." A man stood partly hidden beneath the awning, a tall figure in a dark overcoat, his gloved hands folded before him. As we approached, the light from the nearby lamp glinted off his cufflink silver engraved with a small snake coiled about a circle. Holmes advanced without hesitation. "Good evening," he said quietly. "You have summoned me." The man nodded his head. "I have summoned you, Mr. Holmes, because I believe you are the only man who can finish what began beneath the river." His voice was smooth, but carried an accent French, though softened by years in England. "I am Henry Duval, formerly of the École des Mines. Once I corresponded with Ambrose Leighton. He entrusted to me fragments of his research." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then you are part of the circle." Duval smiled faintly. "Once, yes, but the circle is not what it was. When Leighton died, its purpose shifted. Canning sought profit. Vale sought eternal life. I sought understanding. It is for that reason I come to you now. There is another, an heir to Vale's design, who continues the experiment in secret." "Where?" Holmes demanded. Duval hesitated, glancing around as though fearing unseen listeners in the fog. "In the old mint at Tower Hill. They have converted the underground vaults into a laboratory. I can lead you there, but we must move swiftly. Others know I have spoken to you." Before Holmes could respond, a sharp gunshot split the night. Duval stumbled, clutching his chest, his coat blooming dark beneath his hand. Holmes caught him as he fell. I dropped to one knee beside them, but it was already too late. The bullet had found the heart. His lips moved faintly, and I leaned close to catch his final word. "Tower," he whispered, and then his body went still. Holmes's face was pale but composed. He looked up sharply, scanning the rooftops. A shadow moved briefly against the fog, then vanished. "Sniper," he said shortly. "Professional. Come, Watson, the Mint." We left the body in Lestrade's eventual care and took a cab eastward through the empty streets, the city around us silent as a grave. The tower loomed in the mist like a monument to forgotten ages, its ancient stones gleaming faintly beneath the moon. Behind it, near the old Royal Mint, stood a row of abandoned warehouses, their windows boarded, their gates rusted. Holmes found the entrance with uncanny ease, a narrow door, half buried beneath ivy. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the darkness pressing close. We descended a spiral of stone steps until we reached a high-ceilinged room lit by a single lamp. At its center stood a machine, massive, complicated, and terrible. Its body was made of iron, but its veins were glass tubes through which pulsed a faint blue glow. It made a low hum, rhythmic and deep, like the heartbeat of something not entirely alive. Holmes approached it carefully. "They have rebuilt Leighton's furnace, but larger. Far larger. Observe the wires, Watson. Power is being drawn from the city's own lines. They intend to feed the reaction with electricity from the mains." "And to what end?" I asked. "To turn it into a weapon," he said grimly. "If the reaction is boosted on this scale, the resulting blast could melt a district in moments. The circle no longer seeks transformation. They seek domination." From the shadows came a voice, calm, cold, unmistakable. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, you understand more quickly than I had hoped." We turned. From behind the machine stepped a figure cloaked in darkness. His face was thin, serious, the eyes burning with a familiar fire. Holmes stiffened. "Vale," he breathed. The man nodded his head, smiling faintly. "They thought me dead, as perhaps you did. The fools in the yard buried a corpse weighted with scrap, believing it mine. You were kind enough to provide me the time I required. Holmes's hand went to his revolver. You have murdered, tricked, and endangered an entire city for a dream that should have died with its first victim. Vale's eyes gleamed. A dream cannot die, Holmes. It evolves. The circle was crude, greedy. I am its perfection. Leighton saw only gold. I see creation itself. When this machine wakes up, London will know transformation, not of metal, but of power. You would destroy the city, Holmes said quietly. Not destroy, Vale replied. Remake. In one motion, Holmes lunged forward, but Vale struck a switch upon the control panel. The machine roared to life, the light within its core swelling to blinding brightness. Sparks danced across the floor. The very air vibrated with an unholy sound that made the walls tremble. Watson, the vial! Holmes shouted above the noise. I fumbled for the small flask within my coat and threw it toward the base of the machine. The glass shattered. A burst of vapor erupted, white and hot. Vale staggered back, coughing as Holmes seized the central lever and pulled it down. The machine screamed, then shuddered into silence. When the haze cleared, Vale was gone, vanished into one of the adjoining tunnels, leaving only the echo of his footsteps retreating into the dark. Holmes did not chase him. He stood before the silent machine, his breath ragged. He will return, he said at last. Men like Vale always do. They mistake survival for immortality. We emerged from the Mint just as dawn broke over the Thames. The light touched the river with pale gold, and the city, unaware of its near ruin, stirred to life once more. Holmes watched the horizon, his face drawn but determined. London breathes again, I said softly. For now, he murmured. But the breath of one fire only feeds the next. He turned away from the rising sun and walked toward the waiting cab, his figure dissolving into the morning fog, the only constant shape in a city forever changing, forever on the brink of some new terrible transformation. London, in those restless days that followed, seemed to breathe uneasily, as though beneath its fog-stained surface, the city was aware that something vast and unseen still stirred in its depths. The newspapers spoke only of minor accidents, unexplained. Tremors beneath the river, flickers of light reported near Tower Hill. But Holmes knew better. He moved through those mornings like a man walking across a frozen pond, listening for the faintest crack beneath the calm. For my part, I could not rid my mind of that awful machine, nor of the look in Professor Vale's eyes before he vanished into the tunnels. It was the look of a man who had glimpsed his God and refused to turn away. I'd seen such eyes only once before, in Holmes himself, when his intellect was roused to its fullest flame. But where my friend's genius sought order, Vale's sought domination. That difference, as Holmes once told me, is all that separates the mind of a genius from the mind of a madman. The morning after our encounter at the Mint, I found Holmes pacing before the fire, his pipe long extinguished, the sunlight creeping. Through the curtains fell across maps and diagrams spread over the carpet, each marked with lines of ink, each bearing that same dreadful name, Sabeloft. You are tracing the circle's leftovers? I said quietly. He nodded. The circle was never a single creature, Watson. It was a colony. When Vale fled underground, others scattered. Investors, chemists, smugglers. They are attempting to reconstruct. The machine in fragments, each piece hidden under legitimate businesses. The tower machine was but one organ in a larger creature. He paused and tapped the map. Here, Bishopsgate, where the first furnace burned dot, and here, Lambeth, where telegraph lines connect beneath the power stations. That is their next point of contact. They will need electricity to rebuild. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, a telegram upon her tray. Holmes tore it open and read in silence. A moment later, he handed it to me. From Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Message. Foreign. Agent arrested near Limehouse docks, carrying formula fragments written in Leighton's code. Claims loyalty to Vale. Urgent assistance requested. Holmes's expression hardened. Limehouse, he murmured. Of course, the perfect maze. A dozen wharves, 100 faces, and enough opium smoke to hide an army. Come, Watson, bring your revolver. Within the hour, we were rattling eastward in a cab, through the maze of narrow lanes. A smell of tar and the river's salt rose, thick around us as we approached the docks. A constable met us at the gate and led us to a small office, overlooking the warehouses. Lestrade was there, his face gray with fatigue. On the table lay a stack of papers, brittle with damp, and beside them a man, handcuffed, grumpy, his gaze fixed on the floor. He calls himself Richter, Lestrade said. Claims to be a chemist from Hamburg. We caught him attempting to board a ship bound for Antwerp. Holmes leaned forward, and Lestrade handed him the papers recovered from his coat. I've seen enough to know they're no ordinary bills. Holmes spread them beneath the lamp. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, and horribly familiar. Leighton's, annotated in another hand I recognized instantly from the Cellar ledgers. Vale's. This is no mere fragment, Holmes said grimly. It is an improvement.c here. He has replaced the mercury solution with a salt. It would double the reaction speed. My God, Watson, with this formula, Vale could turn any factory in Europe into a furnace. Richter's lips curled faintly. You English think you can keep the world's progress, he sneered in an accent. The future does not belong to one island. The circle will rise again, and when it does, London will melt before dawn. Holmes looked at him with quiet dislike. Men such as you mistake destruction for progress. The circle promised enlightenment, and you followed it into darkness like moths to a flame. He turned to Lestrade. Guard him well. Vale will not allow his servant to remain alive long enough to talk. Lestrade frowned. You think they'll come for him? I'm certain of it, Holmes replied. Tonight, most likely. You must move him to a secure cell immediately. We left the yard shortly before dusk. The sky above the river glowed with that strange yellow color that comes before a storm. Holmes was silent as we rode home, the lines of his face drawn and cold. When at last we reached Baker Street, he went directly to his desk, took up his violin, and played a low, haunting tune, not for art, but for thought. Around midnight, the storm broke. Rain lashed the windows. Thunder rolled across the rooftops, and lightning flared over the city. Holmes stood at the window, eyes fixed on the darkened skyline. It begins, he said. Listen. I heard nothing but the rain until, faint and distant, came a dull booming sound from the direction of the docks. Holmes seized his coat. They've struck. Vale means to silence Richter before he speaks. The carriage sped through flooded streets, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the stones. When we reached Limehouse, the storm had turned the docks into a swamp. The warehouse that held the yard's makeshift cell was on fire, its windows pouring smoke and flame. Constables shouted orders through the rain, their voices drowned by the crackle of fire. Lestrade met us at the gate, drenched and breathless. They came from the river, he gasped. 2 men, perhaps 3. Richter's gone. We found one of the guards dead. Holmes's eyes flashed with a light that was not fear but fury. Gone where? Lestrade pointed toward the water. They took a boat downstream. Holmes turned to me. The Thames is their road and hiding place. Both if they follow the current. They'll reach the old Blackfriars Arches within the hour. That is where Vale hides. Come, Watson, quickly. We took a police boat and tore downriver through the rain. The lights of the city flickered dimly through the storm. Twisted by the spray. At last, near the arches, Holmes raised his hand. "There," he said. "See the lantern." Through the mist, I glimpsed it. A faint orange glow bobbing near the shadow of the bridge dock. As we drew closer, the outline of another boat appeared. A smaller boat, half full of water, drifting in the current. Two figures struggled aboard it. One standing, commanding, the other tied at the wrists. "Vale and Richter," Holmes whispered. "Ready yourself." The boat cut through the waves, closing the distance. Suddenly, Vale turned, his face caught in the lightning, pale, victorious. "Holmes!" he shouted across the water. "You chase a shadow. You cannot stop what has begun." He threw something into the river, a small metal cylinder, and in the next instant, the water exploded in a hiss of white light. The explosion that followed was not of fire, but of sound. A vibration so deep, it seemed to tear the air apart. Our boat rocked violently. I was thrown to the deck. When I stood up, half blinded by the glare, the other boat was gone, swallowed by the river's black mouth. Holmes steadied himself on the railing, his coat streaming with rain. "Gone," he murmured, and with him, the last fragment. We searched until dawn, but no trace of Vale or Richter was found. The storm had carried all away. Debris, bodies, and perhaps the final secret of Layton's formula dot by the time we returned to Baker Street. The sun had risen, pale and indifferent, over a city that would never know how close it had come to ruin. Holmes sat down heavily in his chair. "It is over," I said. Though the words felt empty, he shook his head. "No, Watson. Knowledge never ends. It merely changes hands. Somewhere, even now, another mind lights the same spark. We may have drowned the fire, but embers travel far." He reached for his pipe, his gaze fixed upon the faint wisp of smoke rising from the fireplace. "And when the circle breathes again," he said quietly, "I shall be waiting." Outside, the storm was gone, but the river kept its secrets, its dark waters carrying away not only the remains of men and machines, but the reflection of a city forever balanced between brilliance and disaster. It was a week before the Thames gave up its silence. The newspapers spoke of wreckage found among the arches of Blackfriars, broken wood, a twisted piece of machinery, and what might have been the shell of a furnace. There were no bodies found, though the police searched for days. Lestrade declared the case closed, the file closed under the heading Industrial Sabotage. Yet, neither Holmes nor I believed that the matter rested so neatly beneath the mud of the river. Holmes did not speak of the circle for several days. He went back to his ordinary cases, missing pearls, fake signatures, a dull trade of routine detection. But I saw in his eyes that the mind beneath was elsewhere. Late at night, when London's hum fell into quiet, I would hear him moving softly about the room, stopping at the window to gaze into the fog, as though searching for some pattern invisible to all but him. One evening, as I returned from my rounds, I found him in the middle of a curious experiment. He had filled several glass jars with different liquids: mercury, salt, and a thin glowing fluid I did not recognize. The faint light shimmered over his hands as he worked, his face serious in concentration. "Holmes," I said, "you cannot mean to repeat Layton's mistake." He smiled faintly without looking up. "Mistake, my dear Watson, is a matter of amount. Layton pursued transformation for power. I pursue it for understanding. The difference lies in purpose." He straightened and looked at the jars with satisfaction. "I am testing the residue recovered from the docks. The reaction has lost its violence, yet something within it remains alive." "Alive? Not in the biological sense," he said, "but reactive. Responsive matter that remembers its origin. A strange thought, is it not? That even destroyed knowledge can echo through its ashes." His words unsettled me. I had seen Holmes in many moods calm, happy, even sad, but never so haunted. He spoke as though the city itself were whispering to him through the chemical haze. The following morning brought a letter from Lestrade, written in a short, rough hand. A body had been discovered near Wapping, washed up by the tide, though unrecognizable by sight. Certain things found upon it: a handkerchief with initials. A ring carved with a snake and circle suggested it to be Silas Canning. Holmes read the note without surprise. "So one branch of the circle rots beneath the river," he murmured. "And what of the root?" We went at once to Wapping. The scene was grim, as all riverside deaths are. The body lay in a small boathouse, covered with canvas. Holmes examined it with professional calm, noting each detail: the torn fingernails, the bruises upon the throat. "Strangled before he entered the water," he said. "Yet not by Vale. This was clumsy work, hasty, frightened. Someone silenced him out of fear, not revenge." Lestrade frowned. "Then the circle turned on itself?" "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "Or perhaps it has a new master." He stepped outside, lighting his pipe. The morning was pale, the mist curling from the river in slow spirals. "The circle of sablecraft," he said softly, "was never a society in the common sense. It was a sickness, an idea that jumped from mind to mind. Vale may have drowned, but his philosophy remains afloat. We must look not for laboratories now, but for minds infected by his ideas." That evening, as the lamps were lit along Baker Street, I found Holmes seated by the fire, turning a small envelope over in his hands. "Delivered by a special messenger," he said, passing it to me. "No return address." Inside was a scrap of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age. Upon it was drawn a circle cut by a vertical line, and beneath, in a neat hand, 4 words: "Transformation is never complete." My pulse quickened. "Vale?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, the handwriting is different. I would call this the work of a student or a successor." He rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where the jars from his experiments stood glimmering faintly in the dim light. "You recall, Watson, the night we found Leighton dead in his cellar. The smell of scorched metal, the hum in the air, that sound has troubled me ever since. It was not mere vibration. It was transmission. The reaction sought to continue, as if it demanded to be carried onward. I begin to think the same law applies to intellect. Destruction does not end the idea. It spreads it." I watched him in silence, unable to shake the image of the blue-lit furnace pulsing beneath the streets. "And what would you have me write in your stories, Holmes?" I asked at last. "That the circle lives on, invisible, whispering through men's ambitions?" He smiled faintly. "Write the truth as you see it, Watson. I leave the meaning to history." For several days London seemed to regain its calm. The fog lifted, trade resumed, and life went on in its uncaring rhythm. Yet beneath that calm, I sensed in Holmes an increasing restlessness. He read hungrily papers on experimental chemistry, reports from the Royal Society, foreign journals from Berlin and Paris. Each morning he marked certain passages, underlining them with precise care. At last, one evening he looked up from his reading. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the German agent Richter who died in the river?" Clearly he spoke of embers traveling far. He was more right than he knew. Listen to this. An article from a Berlin science journal. It speaks of a new process of molecular cleaning, credited to an anonymous British source. The description matches Leighton's formula almost exactly. Someone has already rekindled the fire across the channel. The realization struck me with a kind of cold awe. Then the circle has crossed the sea? Or perhaps, Holmes murmured, it never left. Ideas are not bound by borders, my friend. They seep through wires and whispers carried by ambition and greed. The circle nearly changes its name. He fell silent for a long while. gazing into the fire, and very softly he said, "There are battles one may win in the flesh, Watson, and wars that can only be fought in the mind. This was such a war. And though we have put out the flames in London, the smoke has drifted far beyond our reach." The next morning he was gone. I found upon his desk a note in his fine, sharp handwriting. "Do not be alarmed. I have business abroad concerning the continental aspect of our late affair. Should I not return within 2 weeks, assume that I have succeeded or perished in the attempt. S.H." He left no hint of destination, only the faint scent of tobacco and the lingering vibration of his violin string plucked once before he departed. For 2 weeks I waited, hearing nothing. Then one rain-swept evening a telegram arrived from Dover. "Safe, circle dispersed. Returning home. Holmes." He came back thinner, grayer, but with that same glint of cold triumph in his eyes. Of his adventures abroad he spoke little, save to say that the last surviving members of the circle had been scattered and their laboratories taken apart. "But mark my words, Watson," he added quietly, "the idea will surface again. Perhaps in another century, perhaps in another mask. Men will always dream of turning lead into gold, ignorance into power, and there will always be a price." That night, as I sat at my desk, preparing these notes, I glanced toward the window. The fog had returned, coiling softly around the lamps at Baker Street. From the fireplace came the low murmur of Holmes's violin playing a tune so sad that it seemed to belong to the fog itself. A song for knowledge, for those who had sought to master it, and for those who would inevitably try again. When the last note faded, he set the bow aside and said almost to himself, "The fire sleeps, Watson, but it never truly dies." And in that moment, I understood that the tale of the murder in the Alchemist's cellar was not an ending, but a pause. A single breath between the beating of London's restless heart and the next whisper of the circle, waiting patiently to rise once more from the smoke of its own ashes.